Lady Chatterley's lover, and my name is Morel Bernard. What the eye doesn't see and the mind doesn't know doesn't exist. Connie and Clifford had now been nearly 2 years at Rugby, living their vague life of absorption in Clifford and his work. Their interest had never ceased to flow together over his work. They talked and wrestled in the throes of composition and felt as if something were happening, really in the void. And thus far, it was a life in the void. For the rest, it was non-existence. Rugby was there, the servants, but spectral, not really existing. Connie went for walks in the park and in the woods that joined the park, and enjoyed the solitude and the mystery, kicking the brown leaves of autumn and picking the primroses of spring. But it was all a dream, or rather it was like the simulacrum of reality. The oak leaves were to her like oak leaves seen ruffling in a mirror. She herself was a figure somebody had read about, picking primroses that were only shadows or memories or words. No substance to her or anything, no touch, no contact. Only this life with Clifford, this endless spinning of webs of yarn, of the minutiae of consciousness, these stories, Sir Malcolm said there was nothing in, and they wouldn't last. Why should there be anything in them? Why should they last? Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Sufficient unto the moment is the appearance of reality. Clifford had quite a number of friends, acquaintances really, and he invited them to Rugby. He invited all sorts of people, critics and writers, people who would help to praise his books. And they were flattered at being asked to Rugby, and they praised. Connie understood it all perfectly. But why not? This was one of the fleeting patterns in the mirror. What was wrong with it? She was hostess to these people, mostly men. She was hostess also to Clifford's occasional aristocratic relations. Being a soft, ruddy, country-looking girl inclined to freckles with big blue eyes and curling brown hair and a soft voice and rather strong female loins, she was considered a little old-fashioned and womanly. She was not a little pilchard sort of fish, like a boy with a boy's flat breast and little buttocks. She was too feminine to be quite smart. So the men, especially those no longer young, were very nice to her indeed. But knowing what torture poor Clifford would feel at the slightest sign of flirting on her part, she gave them no encouragement at all. She was quiet and vague. She had no contact with them and intended to have none. Clifford was extraordinarily proud of himself. His relatives treated her quite kindly. She knew that the kindliness indicated a lack of fear, and that these people had no respect for you unless you could frighten them a little. But again, she had no contact. She let them be kindly and disdainful. She let them feel they had no need to draw their steel in readiness. She had no real connection with them. Time went on. Whatever happened, nothing happened, because she was so beautifully out of contact. She and Clifford lived in their ideas and his books. She entertained. There were always people in the house. Time went on as the clock does. 8:30 instead of 7:30. Connie was aware, however, of a growing restlessness. Out of her disconnection, a restlessness was taking possession of her like madness. It twitched at her limbs when she didn't want to twitch them. It jerked her spine when she didn't want to jerk upright but preferred to rest comfortably. It thrilled inside her body, in her womb, somewhere, till she felt she must jump into water and swim to get away from it. A mad restlessness. It made her heart beat violently for no reason, and she was getting thinner. It was just restlessness. She would rush off across the park, abandon Clifford, and lie prone in the bracken to get away from the house. She must get away from the house and everybody. The work was her one refuge, her sanctuary. But it was not really a refuge, a sanctuary, because she had no connection with it. It was only a place where she could get away from the rest. She never really touched the spirit of the wood itself, if it had any such nonsensical thing. Vaguely, she knew herself that she was going to pieces in some way. Vaguely, she knew she was out of connection. She had lost touch with the substantial and vital world. Only Clifford and his books, which did not exist, which had nothing in them, void to void. Vaguely, she knew that it was like beating her head against a stone. Her father warned her again. Why don't you get yourself a boy, Connie? Do you all the good in the world. That winter, Michaelis came for a few days. He was a young Irishman who had already made a large fortune by his plays in America. He had been taken up quite enthusiastically for a time by smart society in London, for he wrote smart society plays. Then gradually, smart society realized that it had been made ridiculous at the hands of a down-at-heel Dublin street rat, and revulsion came. Michaelis was the last word in what was caddish and boundarish. He was discovered to be anti-English. And to the class that made this discovery, this was worse than the dirtiest crime. He was cut dead, and his corpse thrown into the refuse can. Nevertheless, Michaelis had his apartment in Mayfair, and walked down Bond Street the image of a gentleman, for you cannot get even the best tailors to cut their low-down customers when the customers pay. Clifford was inviting the young man of 30 at an inauspicious moment in the young man's career. Yet Clifford did not hesitate. Michaelis had the ear of a few million people, probably. And being a hopeless outsider, he would no doubt be grateful to be asked down to Rugby at this juncture, when the rest of the smart world was cutting him. Being grateful, he would no doubt do Clifford's good over there in America. Kudos. A man gets a lot of kudos, whatever that may be, by being talked about in the right way, especially over there. Clifford was a coming man, and it was remarkable what a sound publicity instinct he had. In the end, Michaelis did him most nobly in a play, and Clifford was a sort of popular hero, till the reaction when he found he had been made ridiculous. Connie wondered a little over Clifford's blind, imperious instinct to become known. Known, that is, to the vast, amorphous world he did not himself know, and of which he was uneasily afraid. Known as a writer, as a first-class modern writer. Connie was aware, from successful, old, hearty, buffing Sir Malcolm, that artists did advertise themselves and exert themselves to put their goods over. That her father used channels ready-made, used by all the other RAs who sold their pictures, whereas Clifford discovered new channels of publicity, all kinds. He had all kinds of people at Rugby without exactly lowering himself, but determined to build himself a monument of reputation quickly. He used any handy rumble in the making. Michaelise arrived duly, in a very neat car with a chauffeur and a manservant. He was absolutely Bond Street, but at right of him something in Clifford's county soul recoiled. He wasn't exactly, not exactly, in fact, he wasn't at all well, what his appearance intended to imply. To Clifford, this was final and enough. Yet he was very polite to the man, to the amazing success in him, the bitch goddess, as she's called, of success, roam snarling and protective round the half-humble, half-defiant Michaelise heels, and intimidated Clifford completely. For he wanted to prostitute himself to the bitch goddess, success also, if only she would have him. Michaelise obviously wasn't an Englishman, in spite of all the tailors, hatters, barbers, booters of the very best quarter of London. No, no, no. He obviously wasn't an Englishman. The wrong sort of flattish, pale face and bearing, and the wrong sort of grievance. He had a grudge, and a grievance that was obvious to any true-born English gentleman who would scorn to let such a thing appear blatant in his own demeanour. Poor Michaelise had been much kicked, so that he had a slightly tail between the legs, look, even now. He had pushed his way by sheer instinct and sheer effrontery onto the stage and to the front of it with his plays. He had caught the public, and he had thought the kicking days were over. Alas, they weren't. They never would be. For he, in a sense, asked to be kicked. He pined to be where he didn't belong, among the English upper classes. And how they enjoyed the various kicks they got at him, and how he hated them. Nevertheless, he travelled with his manservant and his very neat car, this Dublin mongrel. There was something about him that Connie liked. He didn't put on airs to himself. He had no illusions about himself. He talked to Clifford sensibly, briefly, practically, about all the things Clifford wanted to know. He didn't expand or let himself go. He knew he had been asked down to Rugby to be made use of. And like an old, shrewd, almost indifferent businessman or big businessman, he let himself be asked questions. And he answered with as little waste of feeling as possible. Money, he said. Money is a sort of instinct. It's a sort of property of nature in a man to make money. It's nothing you do. It's no trick you play. It's a sort of permanent accident of your own nature. Once you start, you make money. And you go on, up to a point, I suppose. But you've got to begin, said Clifford. Oh, quite, yes. You've got to get in. You can do nothing if you are kept outside. You've got to beat your way in. Once you've done that, you can't help it. But could you have made money except by plays? Asked Clifford. Oh, probably not. I may be a good writer, or I may be a bad one, but a writer and a writer plays is what I am, and I've got to be. There's no question of that. And you think it's a writer of popular plays that you've got to be? Asked Connie. There, exactly, he said, turning to her in a sudden flash. There's nothing in it. There's nothing in popularity. There's nothing in the public, if it comes to that. There's nothing really in my plays to make them popular. It's not that. They just are like the weather, the sort that will have to be for the time being. He turned his slow, rather full eyes that had been drowned in such fathomless disillusion on Connie, and she trembled a little. He seemed so old, endlessly old, built up of layers of disillusion, going down in him generation after generation, like geological strata, and at the same time he was forlorn like a child, an outcast in a certain sense, but with the desperate bravery of his rat-light existence. At least it's wonderful what you've gone at your time of life, said Clifford contemplatively. I'm 30. Yes, I'm 30, said Michael sharply and suddenly, with a curious laugh, hollow, triumphant, and bitter. And are you alone? Asked Connie. How do you mean? Do I live alone? I've got my servant. He's a Greek, so he says, and quite incompetent, but I keep him. And I'm going to marry. Oh, yes, I must marry. It sounds like going to have your tonsils cut, laughed Connie. Will it be an effort? He looked at her admiringly. Well, Lady Chatterley, somehow it will. I find I can't marry an English woman, not even an Irish woman. Try an American, said Clifford. Oh, American. He laughed a hollow laugh. No. I've asked my man if he will find me a Turk or something nearer to the Oriental. Connie really wondered at this queer, melancholy specimen of extraordinary success. It was said he had an income of $50,000 from America alone. Sometimes he was handsome looking. Sometimes he looked sideways, downwards, and the light fell on him. He had the silent, enduring beauty of a carved ivory Negro mask, with his rather full eyes and the strong, queerly arched brows, the immobile, compressed mouth, that momentary but revealed immobility, an immobility, a timelessness which the Buddha aims at and which Negroes express sometimes without ever aiming at it. Something old and acquiescent in the race, eons of acquiescence in race destiny, instead of our individual resistance. And then, as swimming through like rats in a dark river, Connie felt a sudden strange leap of sympathy for him, a leap mingled with compassion and tinged with repulsion, amounting almost to love. The outsider, and they called him a bounder. How much more boundarish and assertive Clifford looked. How much stupider. Michael Eaves knew at once he had made an impression on her. He turned his full, hazel, slightly prominent eyes on her in a look of pure detachment. He was estimating her and the extent of the impression he had made. With the English, nothing could save him from being the eternal outsider, not even love. Yet, women sometimes fell for him. English women, too. Do listen to the next episode of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Join me the next episode of Lady Chatterley's Lover. You've been listening to Morel Bernard.